are they which do hunger. It's an odd that Jesus would actually use this parallel, but he uses hunger and thirst because, number one, it speaks of an appetite. Blessed is the man who hungers and thirsts for what? Here's the key. Righteousness, and then Jesus gives the promise that the man that hungers for that man will be filled. Amen. The beatitude that Jesus is expressing here is that people who have strong desires, man that hungers and thirsts for righteousness shall be filled. This speaks of a strong desire. Listen closely. It speaks of something of a driving passion in man. An ambition. A hunger and thirst communicates to us something that is a deeply felt need. So therefore Jesus would use the words hunger and thirst. That's the point that Jesus is expressing, is that as man hungers and man thirsts, and what that means is those that come into the kingdom, they are characterized by a certain hunger and thirst, a strong desire. They are driven by an ambition, and they have a very intense pursuit. Think just a moment. When Jesus is speaking here, he is not at all speaking of a worldly pursuit. As we spoke about last week, he's not talking about a man who goes after material things. Nothing wrong with that. It's not worldly possessions that characterizes a citizen in the kingdom. It's that hunger and that thirst, that driving passion that they have for what is righteous. Now, why does Jesus use this parallel? Let me show you. Not for the purpose of luxury. Listen to me. Hunger and thirst speaks of food and water. Food and water are not luxuries, they are necessities of life. In other words, you cannot live without food and water. You'll only survive so long without food and water. Because food and water is a necessity. Listen to me. Righteousness is a necessity. Amen. When a man comes to God, righteousness is a necessity. He has no access to God unless righteousness is imparted to him. It's impossible to live without food or water in the natural. Listen now. It's impossible to live in God's kingdom without righteousness. So our physical life depends on food and water. Listen, our spiritual life depends on righteousness. It's rare for us in this society to ever really know what hunger and thirst is. Because it can be so quickly and so easily satisfied. So we don't know what that craving, that painful, that urge in there to want something. And really when Jesus is speaking of this, that's what he's speaking about when he says man who hungers and thirsts. He's talking about that man that wants righteousness more than he wants anything else. He's got to have it because there's such an urge in here for what is righteous. Oh God, give us people that way again. Amen. It seems we're just too satisfied whether I get filled or whether I don't. I realize Brother Man's going to come down in a minute. He said that's because that hunger and thirst that God created in us for that is being satisfied by something else. That's right. Hunger has always been a close neighbor to the human race. Why does Jesus borrow this? The physical hunger of man, which becomes such a desperate thing. It's only sort of a small symbol, listen close, of a deeper, more serious hunger of the heart that is identified here, and that is man's spiritual hunger. Now, Brother Branham says something that really captivates me, because I wouldn't think that all men were created this with, but Brother Branham says every human being, God puts within them a hunger and a thirst for God. But then he says, shame on any man that would try to satisfy that thirst and that hunger for God and satisfy it with the things of the world. The parallels are drawn so that we can understand this. When we talk about someone being hungry or someone being thirsty, to us, that means we missed our lunch or we missed our supper by 15 or 20 minutes. But when the Bible speaks about it, Jesus speaks about this, when there's such an urgent need, listen, which there is no immediate solution. And so there comes this pain. There comes this, what the prophet God would say, a painful desire that becomes intense. I don't know if anybody has literally tried to fast, and then you fast for a little bit and you start getting them painful desires. Do you realize every man and woman that's sitting here tonight that's saved by the grace of God, you had that one time or you'd never been saved? Why? Because what happens is that painful desire sets in, listen close, what the prophet would preach as desperation. I've got to have it or I'll die. Amen. Then that unsaved person, that heart is moved, the Holy Spirit deals with them. They hear the gospel. God by grace gives them sort of some understanding of the gospel message. And then the Holy Spirit awakens in them by a work of God and an immense compulsion toward righteousness that nothing else can satisfy. And what happens? They yearn. They cry. They weep. They know if I don't get this, I'll die. When a man's a sinner and the Holy Spirit goes after that man and he convicts that man's heart, there's a yearning. We say, well, there's a yearning to be right. Hold on. There ain't a yearning just to be right. There's a yearning for righteousness. It don't mean just be right. It means that man yearns to be right with God. And the only way you can be right with God is God has to satisfy that longing with righteousness.